mask out the light areas, I'm using Daniel Smith's masking fluid, and it comes with these little applicators which you put on the spout here, and it creates these lovely thin lines, which is perfect, especially for the ship's rigging, which I'm about to sort of apply here, and also some of the white and lights on the boat as well. With the reflections, I'm sort of creating sort of more open-ended sort of squiggly lines, so it looks like it's water, and I'm applying a little bit to the land here where I can see some light areas. I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally. I'm using Daniel Smith's Cerulean and one of my favourite colours, Buff Titanium, for the sky and the water. So starting off with the Buff Titanium, which is a lovely light neutral colour. Now if you don't have it, don't worry, you could use raw sienna or yellow ochre. I'm actually mixing in a tiny pinch of permanent rose. So I'm going to add a little bit more Buff Titanium to that to make it really a light pink. This is for the sort of middle of the sky and water. And then some cerulean. You can use cobalt blue, and I'm mixing up a large puddle of milky cerulean. So always prepare your colours beforehand. I'm using a large brush to wet the paper. Lots and lots of clean water. Spend some time doing this to allow the water to soak into the sort of centre of the paper, and make sure there are no puddles. So do tilt your paper and collect any puddles with a clean damp brush before you start painting. I'm loading my brush, fully loading it, and painting it in the middle of the sky where you can see that light area. So plenty of that Buff Titanium wet into wet, and paint the reflection of that Buff Titanium colour wet into wet. You can use raw sienna, remember, as an alternative. Now the Buff Titanium with the permanent rose, wet into wet, above and below the Buff Titanium. I'm adding the Buff Titanium with the permanent rose above and below the reflection as well, so it's mirroring what's going on in the sky. And I'm painting it wet into wet using that large mop brush. Adding a little bit more of that pale pink here on the top part of the sky, more damp into wet so it's not as wet, and you can take the excess paint off on your paper towel. I'm loading my brush with the cerulean. I'm painting wet into wet at the top part of the sky, allowing it to kind of run into the pale pink. And I'm just swishing that cerulean loaded brush into the pale pink there as well, about 50-50. Mixing up some more cerulean now, quite creamy, using that large brush. And I'm painting it damp into wet at the top part of the sky, where it's a little bit stronger in colour and tonal value. I've mixed up a little bit of pink with the cerulean there, and I'm painting damp into damp onto the horizon area of the sky and in the water where it's reflecting that area of the sky. And I'm painting some cerulean at the bottom of the water there, damp into wet with a large brush. And I'm tilting the painting to allow the paint to flow to the edge where I can collect some puddles. Sometimes those puddles can run back into your painting to cause cauliflowers. Mixing up some ultramarine and cerulean here, about 50-50, and I'm painting the bottom of the sea damp into damp with my large brush, and I'm tilting that colour to allow it to flow up into the lighter colours there. So that area is the nearest to us, and it's stronger in colour and tonal value, but I felt it was a bit too strong, so I'm using a clean damp brush just to blend it into the paler colour and actually to dilute it slightly so it's not as strong. So you can actually change things in watercolour. Just be brave and be the boss. Collecting puddles now with a paper towel, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I am mixing up some of the ultramarine with a little bit of raw sienna. There's a pinch of cerulean in there as well. And I've also got a little bit of cadmium yellow with the cerulean. So I'm going to be painting the land wet on dry, and I'm sort of going to mix the colours on the paper as well. So I'm starting off here at the land furthest away, using some raw sienna with a pinch of cerulean and a little bit of yellow. I've used my paper towel, as you saw there, just to help me sort of paint along here. and I'm using the tip of the brush. Really load that brush though, have plenty of paint on your brush so your painting doesn't dry too quickly. That's one of the real secrets of watercolour. Always load your brush. So loading my brush again here with just some cerulean with a bit of the raw sienna and pushing it in to the previous colours and dropping that sort of blue-green here on to the previous colours, just to mix them on the paper wet into wet. And I'm varying the colours as well. A little bit more raw sienna here, and it's all wet on dry but also wet into wet as you push and drop colours in to the left hand side. This is some cerulean with the ultramarine with a pinch of the raw sienna, a pinch of yellow. So I'm basically using raw sienna, yellow, cerulean, ultramarine, and I will be using quinacridone gold and burnt sienna. As I say, a full list of materials I'm using will be in the description below. So here's a yellow green, it's wet on dry, pushing it in, wet into wet to the colours on the left so they mix together. It's a really good colour mixing exercise as well for mixing colours on the paper. So a little bit more yellow here with a pinch of the cerulean, so you've got a yellow green, and I'm dropping that in wet into wet on the left. Wet on dry here and wet into wet, so you can see the pattern almost changing those colours. I must say the sort of colours in the photograph really have inspired me as well. I'm not literally copying them, I'm just using them or using the photograph as a reference for my painting. So I'm going to use some quinacridone gold. If you don't have any, you can continue with the raw sienna or yellow ochre. This is a little bit creamier, slightly darker. Darker because I'm using less water, a little bit more paint, so it's a stronger tonal value. A little bit of ultramarine here with a pinch of that quinacridone gold and dropping that in damp into wet. So you can see it's a little bit darker. The trees here to the right of the photograph are a little bit stronger. This land is slightly nearer to us, so I'm sort of exaggerating that here. A little bit misty as it goes off into the distance there on the left. So the trees are getting larger here, stronger in tone of value, sort of brighter colours. And I've actually kind of used a bit of artistic license here as well, because I've extended the trees on the right to enable me to put the sailing boat more to the left of the painting. I've used the rule of thirds, so it's on sort of almost a third of the way down. It's a little bit over that, but it's sort of a third of the way in, and it's a nice way of sort of composing a landscape or a seascape painting. It creates a lot of harmony and balance. So I'm mixing up some buff titanium now, of course, my favourite colour, just to paint some of that light area, wet on dry, just sort of below the sort of land there, and just a bit above as well. I've sort of almost painted in a little bit of the reflection there using a size 8 mop brush. It's a slightly smaller brush, and just sort of softening and blending there at the bottom with a clean damp brush. Going back into the ultramarine and quinacridone gold, a little bit more of those colours. You can see it makes a lovely dark using more ultramarine and less quinacridone gold, but also less water. And painting this damp into damp, varying those colours. Now I'm turning my painting sideways to kind of create a bit of texture now at the top of the tree. So I'm rolling my brush so you can see there's a little bit more texture here. These trees are the nearest to us, so I wanted to create not only darker tonal values, stronger colours, but also some texture. And this will sort of create the illusion that these trees are nearer to us. And I'm using stippling and more details and textures here, using the tip of my brush just to create more information, more textures, more contrast. This will all sort of pull these trees a little bit closer to us and make the land to the left and even in the middle a little bit further away. And it creates depth in the painting. And just adding a little bit of dark at the bottom, damp into damp, using the ultramarine and quinacridone gold, mostly to the right and not much to the left as it's further away. And I'm just softening this dark here with a clean damp brush. I felt it was coming forward too much. I want the darks to be stronger on the right, the land that is nearest to us. Adding a little bit more dark here to the right using the Ultramarine and Quinacridone Gold with my size 8 mop brush. Just a little bit of detail and then softening the hard edge at the bottom as I'm going to paint the reflections now. To prepare myself for the reflection, I'm just going to use clean water. And I'm very carefully wetting the seawater just below the land. And I'm going to be painting wet into wet. I'm just being mindful not to disturb the drying wash because watercolour isn't permanent. So I'm starting off with some of the raw sienna. You saw that I took off the excess paint off on the paper towel because I'm working damp into damp. So bigger marks on the right and they get smaller as they go off into the distance. This is a little bit of the Ultramarine and Quinacridone Gold. I'm just painting some of the reflections here, a little bit of wet into wet there, just to let it flow into that raw sienna. This is a really nice controlled way of painting reflections. So I'm using the same colours that I used for the land, but they're a little bit paler. And I'm just sort of using opened end marks there, almost zigzags, so it looks like movement in the water. So I'm not copying the photograph exactly. This is a little bit more ultramarine with Quinacridone Gold. I'm painting damp into damp here. Just some of the darks that you can see in the photograph. Again, I'm using it as a reference. I'm not slavishly copying it, just to kind of create the impression of reflections there. And they get smaller as they go off to the left. Adding a little bit more of the reflections here to the right hand side. And I'm mixing up ultramarine with burnt sienna. As you can see there, I haven't got a lot of water in there. It's quite creamy. I've taken the excess off on the paper towel and I'm painting damp into damp to create those darks there. Paint horizontal marks, large on the right and they get smaller as they go off to the left. I'm rinsing my brush now. I'm taking the excess water off my brush, so it's a thirsty brush, and I'm soaking up the paint there to create some lighter reflections. Each time you do this, try to rinse your brush, take the excess water off on a paper towel and then allow the brush to soak up the paint to create these lighter areas. It's really effective, especially sometimes if you've overpainted. Make sure it's a clean, damp, thirsty brush and it creates that light going through the reflections. So just lifting off a few more lights here to create the look of water. And I'm removing the masking fluid now with a piece of framing tape. You can use masking tape, a putty rubber, even your thumb. What I'm doing now is I have mixed up ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm just going to paint the darks on the boat using my size 8 brush. Do use a brush that you're comfortable with. So if you find your brush is too large, go to a smaller brush. And it's a sort of a grey colour here. So this is all wet on dry. And I'm going to paint this as simple as I can. I don't want it to be too fussy or detailed. And this is kind of just adding some of the darks and details that I can see on the boat and the reflections. So I'm just rinsing my brush now using a clean damp brush just to soften that reflection. Now I actually softened that, it was too much. So I've just added a little bit more water to that and I'm lifting off just to push that back a little bit. So when things like that happen in watercolour, it doesn't go your way, don't panic, just sort of wet it with a clean damp brush, lift off with a paper towel. So just adding a few more sort of grey sort of reflections here. And I'm painting in the mast, wet on dry, not as it is in the photograph, more sort of wriggly lines so that it looks like sort of ripples and it creates the illusion of water. And I've left little gaps as well. I'm just softening there with a clean damp brush. Still using the ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm painting a few more details here on the boat, wet on dry, just to bring it to life. You don't have to paint everything in the photograph. I've turned the painting sideways so I can sort of paint a straightish line. And as you can see there, it's not completely straight, but in the photograph, there's a slight angle to this anyway. But I'm using the ultramarine burnt sienna mix, wet on dry with the size 8 brush. Just softening with a clean damp brush to create some lighter greys here on the boat and a few more darks and details. I've watered down the ultramarine and burnt sienna, and there's even a pinch of the buff titanium there, and I'm just painting a few ripples cutting through the reflection there to create the illusion of water. Smaller gaps further away, bigger gaps as it comes towards you in the foreground. Adding a few more darks to the shoreline here, just to make that look like land and the water to look like water. I've used ultramarine burnt sienna with the buff titanium. You can use raw sienna. Just a few little dark marks just here and there, damp into damp. I'm using a clean damp brush just to soften some of those marks, to push them back, to make them look more natural. I'm going to allow my painting to dry for the last time. I'm actually peeling off the masking fluid below the land there, just on the water's edge. And as you can see, it's created some lovely highlights. And I'm just using a clean damp brush just to soften and just sort of awaken up some of the wash there, just to make some of those marks look a little bit more natural. And I'm just using some white gouache, wet on dry, to create some more reflections and lights. If you've lost your light, it's a very useful thing to do, and a few sort of highlights in the water there for ripples. To finish off my painting, I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube and get access to my exclusive watercolour tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will find more information about the membership in the description below. Just click Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.